Am I on now? Oh. Hi everyone, good morning. And welcome to this session on really exciting topic of threat modelling. So just to start, a little bit of an introduction to Secarma, the business that I work for. We're on a stand upstairs, so if you want to come and tell us how bad this was afterwards, don't. But if you want to come and learn a little bit more about us and what we do, you're more than welcome to come and see us. So we are primarily a penetration testing business based about 5 miles down the road, so we're Manchester local. We also offer complementary services, everything that you would expect of your in-house security team, only we are an outsourced option. So that might look like various accreditation schemes, so we're a Cyber Essentials certification body. We also offer a certification scheme for IoT devices to make sure that they comply with the new IoT legislation that's already in force. We offer bespoke consultancy. We do security training, so that might be end user training, it might be technical training for your developers, it could be security awareness training for your board. And we also offer a range of vulnerability scanning and management services. So myself, my name's Jen Williams. I'm an ISO 27001 lead auditor, Cyber Essentials Plus assessor. I'm a certified pen tester as well, so I have got that kind of balance of governance and technical. My job title, I'm Director of IT and Operations at Secarma, which means that I get involved in a little bit of everything. So I am one of those people that understands the internal challenges of implementing security, as well as, being sat on the other side of the fence and telling you that you should. I have quite a number of years working in heavily regulated industries, including the legal sector. I've done a lot in financial as well. My particular area of passion is helping SMEs to get started on their cybersecurity journey. So my last role was with a very small SME that grew very large in a particular sector, and I've got that insight of being able to help start that journey. Okay, really quickly then. So threat modelling it's not a new concept, and it's probably been around for a long time, maybe called different things, but it's the process of identifying threats before you've even written a single line of code or you've implemented any infrastructure. It's a risk management activity, and it has, a lot of not only security benefits, but efficiency benefits in the way that you develop or put together infrastructure or applications. And it's performed by those who are going to be, working on the actual project itself. So a little bit of a comparison between threat modelling and penetration testing. This is a question I get asked a lot. We already penetration test, why should we threat model? So threat modelling is non-invasive, it's theoretical, it's a tabletop exercise, and it's done by your internal resources primarily, whilst you can engage with a third party to, facilitate a threat modelling exercise. Actually, it's best done by those people within the business who know the application or the infrastructure that you're developing inside out. And it seeks to identify threats at design phase as opposed to, penetration testing, which is done maybe pre-production. So for penetration testing, you actually need significant technical experience to be able to run a good test. It may actually be that you can't do that yourself and you need to outsource that to a third party like Secarma. It's invasive, so actually, it's exploiting those vulnerabilities that are there, not just kind of thinking about them. And it can be used to verify the threat modelling activity that you've done early on. So, okay, we think that we've identified all of these potential vulnerabilities at design phase. Let's have a look now that we've actually put this into production and see that our threat modelling activities have actually worked. So whilst they're very different, they are complementary services. So what kind of businesses should threat model? So again, this is another question I ask. I only do this, or I only conduct a particular activity as part of my business. Do I even need to threat model? So these are just some examples of businesses that should threat model. So I suppose the given is anybody developing software. So if you're doing any kind of internal or any software that's supposed to be used by, your customers, then absolutely you should threat model. Anybody using large amounts of data via APIs, threat modeling is a really good activity and can be very useful whilst, you're figuring out how those APIs fit together. Businesses who have complex business processes, so I'm not just talking about software here, I'm talking about maybe you've got a complex, staff onboarding process that means data has to travel between, lots of different departments or maybe even third parties. I don't know if maybe you go through security clearance or you go through another kind of check before you onboard somebody. Any business where data loss could cause a catastrophic business damage or reputational damage. I read a statistic not that long ago that actually the vast majority of small and medium enterprises that suffer a data loss will financially never recover from it. And I know Michael sat at the back will completely recognise that stat because he gave that to me, 2 days ago? So for SMEs, it's particularly important, and it's actually a much more cost-effective way of testing and evaluating those risks early on. And then a given, it's any business is holding sensitive data, you want to know what the risks are that, that are facing that data that you hold. Okay, what kind of systems use threat modeling? So this doesn't have to be software. I think most people, when they hear of threat modeling, hear of it in terms of software, and actually it can be applied to even paper-based systems or just business processes. The threat modeling frameworks that I'll come to a little bit later on, they're designed for different purposes. So even if you've got kind of a very old school paper-based system, it's still worth threat modeling it because actually they're the things that you can't test in other ways. You can't penetration test a filing system, so this becomes a really good option for evaluating those vulnerabilities. Okay, why would you threat model? So during this part of the talk, I am going to divert back to software development a little bit more because I think that's the area that people are familiar with when they talk about threat modeling. But threat modeling helps you to detect problems early in the development lifecycle before coding begins. And anybody that works in development or manages development or even commissions development projects will know how costly it can be when you get to production and then suddenly you find that, you've got a problem with your authentication system. Actually ripping that out, going back and doing it again can be painful. It helps you to spot design flaws that other testing methods and code reviews might have overlooked. So maybe as part of your threat modeling exercise, you've discovered that all of those Amazon Web Services that you think you needed, actually maybe you only need a small proportion of them because you've looked into your design phase a little bit deeper. It helps you to evaluate new forms of attack that you might not have considered otherwise. So the frameworks are really specifically designed to help you to look at the different attack vectors. And actually maybe as developers, you haven't thought of one of these ways into your system. You can actually maximize your testing budget. So if you're doing this threat modeling and the risk assessment early in the process, you often find as a byproduct of that, not only are our security features better, but you've created efficiencies elsewhere. So therefore, when you come to test at the end, you can prioritize the areas that you've identified during the threat modeling as higher risk. So it allows the organization to take a much more what I'd call risk-based approach. So you don't have to test everything in the same level of detail because actually you've identified part of it presents the most risk of vulnerabilities, and that's where you target your testing budgets at. It also helps you to identify security requirements. It's actually a really difficult exercise. I've done this myself when we've been commissioning development projects to think about those security requirements, and threat modeling helps you to do that in a structured way. So this is stuff you're probably already doing without realizing, but adding a structure to it just makes it more impactful and make sure that you've considered it holistically. You can remediate problems before the software's even been released. You don't need recoding. You don't have as many post-deployment issues because actually you've identified all those potential issues early on, and you've written those into your specifications, or you've written them into your, your statements of work for outsourcing these projects. You can think about different threats that you wouldn't have thought about beyond standard attacks, and it actually makes it more relevant to the application that you're developing. And it'll help you to identify the critical components of the infrastructure or the application that you are developing. Obviously creates a more robust application as a result. And yeah, I've already mentioned this point, but I'm a huge fan of a risk-based approach to business. So having worked as an IT director, it's really easy to be dictated to that actually we need everything to be 100% secure. We must finish all of these projects so that, nobody can attack us. But actually, lots of projects, 80% complete, reduces your risk far more than, one completed to 100% in some cases. So it's allowing you to really focus the efforts on the high-risk areas. Okay, so now we're talking about when you would threat model and at what part of the process you threat model. So it really depends on your approach to development. So it depends on whether you're using an agile methodology or whether you're using waterfall, but definitely incorporating at the design stage. So if you're using waterfall, you do it right at the beginning when you're identifying all of your requirements and writing your specifications. If you're using agile, then you would typically do this at the start of a sprint when you're identifying what's going to go into that sprint. You'd absolutely do it again prior to deployment. So when you're at your functional testing phase, that's when you can repeat your threat modeling exercise and just make sure that actually in that time you haven't become aware of anything new, nothing's changed in the application. You do it on a significant change or upgrade. So let's say you're releasing a new feature, or maybe you've migrated to a different infrastructure. At that point, you would also threat model. And then a really key one that we've all been through fairly recently is in response to significant world events. So I'm sure that the Ukrainian war will have presented new risks to people working in certain sectors. Absolutely everybody who's then started working from home during the COVID pandemic, threat modeling would have been a really good way to maybe prevent some of the additional cyber attacks that happened to businesses during that different period. Okay, so what are the outcomes of a good threat modeling exercise? So you'll have a data flow diagram that shows entry points into your system or potential entry points into your system. You'll also get from it a prioritized list of vulnerabilities. So you can then from those produce your treatment plans, present them to the board for hopefully budget approval so that you can, you can work out which ones absolutely need treating, which you're going to insure against, and which you're going to accept. You'll almost certainly have other business efficiencies. So I mentioned the one about unneeded Amazon services earlier, but that's inevitably a byproduct of a good threat modeling exercise. And hopefully from it as well, you'll have contingency plans. So you'll be able to look at what happens if this threat materializes. What do we need to do to prevent that happening? So this can also really help for writing disaster recovery and business continuity plans. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, okay, if you can't do this for us, who needs to be involved? So Secarma's role in threat modeling is we would typically train somebody in your business to be able to facilitate threat modeling. At the risk of sounding like the worst salesperson in the world, which I admittedly am, if we were to come into your business and do a threat modeling exercise, we'd probably miss a lot of what your developers will be able to identify, because we don't have that intimate knowledge of the system that you're building or of your business or your business processes. So typically we'd either facilitate the exercise or we would train somebody within your business about how to facilitate the exercise. So yeah, anybody with knowledge of customers or third-party interactions would be key as well. So, you know, your customer success managers or your sales team who are interacting with customers on a daily basis, and anybody who manages those third-party relationships, if we're talking about paper-based systems or, you know, onboarding processes, or if we're consuming APIs, those who are, you know, dealing with those APIs on a daily basis. This is not an exercise for people external to the project. It needs to be those who understand those relationships really well. Okay, there are two major threat modeling approaches. So we have the attacker-led, which is all about understanding the different threat actors that may be targeting your application or your business. And it's used to think about those key entry points rather than the system as a whole. So you might, I don't know, maybe your business tests on animals. So actually you're probably a target for hacktivists as opposed to those who are financially motivated. And that presents a different attack vector and a whole different set of risks to maybe a financial services business who are targeted by financially driven attackers. So you might be thinking about completely different risks there, which is why where the attacker-led focus can be beneficial. The focus of an attacker-led approach is on those critical assets. So we're making sure that, you know, the key entry points and the most important parts of the system is protected. Conversely, the system-led approach focuses on everything, so focuses on the entire development, so it can be a lot more comprehensive. It's a much more long-winded process. So you consider each individual component at this point rather than just the key entry points. It also considers wider business assets, so maybe parts of your infrastructure that aren't specifically related to this project, but could be impacted by an attack on the system that you're building. Oh, that one didn't work for whatever reason. Okay, so the different approaches of threat modeling all follow a similar kind of process. So you're asking yourself the following questions. So what is it that we're actually building? So you're going to, at this point, you're designing it. Then you're going to think about somebody trying to break it. So what could possibly go wrong? What could somebody do to really mess up my project? And then you start thinking about actually what could we do to prevent that from happening? And then afterwards, when you're in the verification stage, you're asking, did we do a good job of preventing the worst case scenario from happening? A little bit about risk scoring. So anybody that's worked on kind of ISO 27001 implementations will be really familiar with this. So when you identify the risks during your threat modeling exercise, you typically score these using DREAD. I quite like this because it's nice and easy to remember, and everybody associates security with doom and gloom, so I quite like the acronym. So you're looking at the damage, the reproducibility, the exploitability, the spread of affected users, and how easy it is to discover that this has actually happened. So there's a calculation just at the bottom of the screen, which I don't need to read out, I'm sure, but so you would end up with a DREAD score for each of the risks that you identify during the threat modeling process, and this allows you to prioritize these risks for fixing. And actually, part of this process is to speak to the senior leadership team within the business to identify what risks are we willing to tolerate, what level of risk is acceptable for this project, so that you can align the risks that you tolerate within this project against the business's risk tolerance. Okay, moving on now to some of the threat modeling frameworks that we've helped businesses to implement or we've trained them on. There are different frameworks that suit different purposes. I think most people who've looked at threat modeling at all will have heard of Stride. This is the one that's used by Microsoft whenever they're designing new products or new features. So it's really high-level modeling, and it's applicable to all kinds of application. I would also say that Stride is usable for these kind of low-technology, paper-based and process-driven systems. So, and it's looking at spoofing, so, and it's looking at tampering, so making sure that you can, that the data that you're holding can't be changed. Repudiation, so ownership of actions. Information disclosure, so making sure that the data can't be leaked outside of the container that it's in. Denial of service, so when we're looking at applications, I think that becomes pretty obvious, but looking at paper-based systems, denial of service could be something like, I know there's an office fire or somebody can't find a key. And then escalation of privileges, so making sure that people have only got access to the right level of data for their job roles. We do a lot of work on testing applications using the OWASP Top 10. So it's application focused. If anybody's ever had a penetration test done on an application, it's likely to have used this methodology. It's updated every few years with the most common vulnerabilities in web apps. However, I think anybody who's looked at OWASP Top 10 for the last kind of 10 years will notice that actually the threats on there haven't changed all that much. And the vulnerabilities that are seen now are actually still fairly similar to those that were on the list 5 and 6 years ago. So SQL injection doesn't seem to have disappeared from that list. And this is a really good one for eliminating what I'd describe as the low-hanging fruit. So in your applications, eliminating the OWASP Top 10 vulnerabilities actually covers the vast majority of attacks, and this is a risk management exercise. This is all about reducing the risk instead of making everything completely watertight, because that's for your post-production. The MITRE ATT&CK framework, so this is probably the biggest framework that's used for threat modeling, and this can be quite a comprehensive review, whereas Stride is done at a higher level. This one goes much deeper into the actual methodologies that attackers will use. It identifies 14 tactics and actually breaks down the goals of the attacker and how they actually get to that goal. So it describes a specific technique that attackers will use to, let's say the goal is to steal passwords. It describes actually the different methodologies that they might use to steal those passwords. So there's an example there. So user credentials acquired by a brute force attack, dumping credentials from the operating systems, and then it'll provide a comprehensive guidance for the entry points that you should think about to prevent that from happening. There's a privacy-specific framework called Linden. So if actually you're worried about personal data leakage and that's a particular risk for your business, then you might decide to conduct your threat modeling against a privacy-specific framework like this. And actually, there's no reason whatsoever why you can't use a combination of the different threat modeling frameworks. So you might use Stride, and then on part of your application where Stride identifies you've got a particular risk to personal data, you might decide to use Linden on that specific area of the application. Okay, so I quite enjoy doing these. So these are attack trees. So an attack tree is a threat modeling exercise that shows you how an attack could happen. For each layer of the tree, you're asking yourself, what does the attacker need? So I've got a really nice non-cybersecurity example coming up, but So let's say the attacker is looking to compromise credentials. Then you ask yourself, okay, what do they need to compromise credentials? And you'll come up with a whole list of things they need. They might need, I don't know, for your system, they might need the IP address to be able to do that. They might need to be physically located in your office to do that. And then you take one of those examples and you say, okay, for them to be physically located in the office, they're going to need a swipe card. Okay, what do they need to do to get one of those? Well, actually, they need to pretend that they're an employee. Can you see how this kind of works its way down? So to pretend to be an employee, they're probably going to need a falsified letter of employment. They're probably going to need to know somebody in your HR department or pretend to be somebody else who already works there. Brilliant. What do they need for that? So you're kind of working down, and the whole idea is that you're cutting that tree as close to the top as possible. So actually, if you can stop them at the swipe card point of being physically in your office, then that's a lot more cost effective than if you're having to stop them much further down your tree, because there's a lot more controls that need to be implemented at that point. And a really nice example I like to show of this is the Ocean's 11 heist, because everyone's seen that film, everyone loves the film. Okay, so the goal was to rob the casino. On the next level, you see the required steps to be able to rob the casino. And then you see, for each of those steps, the sub-steps, if you like, that are needed there. So the idea is if you can stop them at raid the registers, that becomes much more cost-effective for you than, trying to stop them recruiting a henchman at the bottom. So these become a really good tool for helping you to prioritize where you should apply the fixes to your application or your process. Okay, so I was just going to leave a little bit of time at the end in case anybody wants to ask me any very easy questions. Yes?
So typically, what's your approach when you come into an organisation? How do you start, how do you finish, and how long does that process normally take?
Okay, so the question is, how do we typically approach this with an organisation? When do we go in? How long does it typically take? And actually, it depends entirely on your objectives. So if you're, let's say, just testing a web application and you design a new web application, we'd look at your business risk appetite. We'd look at, the outcomes that you're wanting from the threat modeling exercise. If it's a list of security requirements, then we might look at the MITRE framework. So it entirely depends on what you're looking to achieve. There'd be no point in me going into an SME with a tiny budget for security and saying, right, we need to do a full MITRE attack review of your application, because in reality, you're going to be limited as to the number of fixes you can apply. And I think that's one of the reasons why Secarma are quite strong at this, is we have a real pragmatic approach to, we'll help you do the maximum that you're able to do, as opposed to just recommending that actually you should shut everything down, make it all secure, don't ever let anybody in, because it's not always practical. You still have to trade, and it still has to fit within what you're able to spend on it. So I think talk to us, and we'll recommend an approach that will work. I think the last engagement I did, I trained a group of developers on how to threat model, and they wanted to threat model using the STRIDE framework. So yeah, we helped them to build that into their software development lifecycle. Right, any others?
Yeah, I'll ask.
Of course.
So you mentioned the attacker-led and the system-led approach.
Yeah.
And the use of developers or SMEs to be
Yeah.
involved in the threat modeling. How do you mitigate the risk of, let's say, a failure of imagination? So you mentioned the employee example.
Yeah.
Right? What if the person just parked up outside your office and hacked your Wi-Fi?
I mean, again, this is a risk management exercise. So you're never going to be able to say everything's 100% secure. So that's why I think these frameworks are really good, because they do kind of shape your thinking for each part. So again, the MITRE attack framework, I think, goes into the most amount of detail about that. And part of it will be threat modeling your infrastructure as well as the application that's sat on top of it. So yeah, you're never going to stop everything. But I think this takes away the need for imagination, because actually it's all frameworked for you, and there's limited scope for missing things out if you follow one of these frameworks. I think, have we got time for one more question? Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. And yeah, if you want to come and talk to us, we're upstairs on the big purple stand. So thank you very much, guys.